Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I have Matt Lipscomb, the CEO and founder of DMC Biotechnologies. So Matt, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks for your time today.
All right. So tell me about DMC. What's the premise of the company?
Sure. So we are a spin-out from Duke University. So our core technology was invented by my co-founder there, Dr. Mike Lynch. The premise of the company is basically that for the last 15, 20 years, industrial biotechnology, so using biotech to make things like specialty chemicals or all the way up to commodities and fuels, has basically taken a very long time and a significant amount of money. And there are a number of sort of technical challenges and barriers that the field has faced for a long time. And the premise of DMC and the technology that Mike invented was basically to address those things. And so it's bringing down the cost of development, so the cost from project inception all the way through demonstration of commercially relevant metrics, being able to do that at a time and a price point that enables going after multiple specialty chemical products. So it's a major disruption in the field as it currently stands.
Well, what are some specifics? What are some chemicals that are in high demand, and how are they produced now, and how would you propose producing them instead?
Sure. So there's largely two big buckets of chemicals these days, right? So there are things that are made from petroleum or petroleum derivatives, and that's the lion's share of the things that consumers use and interact with on a everyday basis. And then there's another cohort of chemicals, especially chemicals that are either made by fermentation from some sort of natural organism, or they may be extracted from various plant materials. But usually they're things that are smaller volume, they're higher price, higher margin, and usually they have some structural complexity such that getting there from a petrochemical route is just simply not possible for a variety of reasons. And so in the molecules and the products that we're going after, there are some of both. There are some that are currently produced by fermentation. There are some that are currently extracted, and there are some that are currently made from petrochemical-based routes.
Okay, so again, what's an example or two of? Are you at the point where you've found an alternate path to produce some of the major chemicals that are needed out there, and what are they? If so,
sure. So I can give you a couple examples. So I think one of the most interesting ones is this compound called limonene. So if you have any cleaning products in your home that basically say citrus cleaner, so that's basically limonene. And the way that's made presently is it's a byproduct from the citrus industry. So effectively, the citrus growers take the oranges, they press them to get juice, and then they essentially do an extraction, a steam extraction on the parts that are left over, so the pulp and the peel. And then what comes out of that is essentially an orange oil. So they use that in sort of essential oils, and then also limonene. And then it's about a $500 million a year market that goes into all sorts of natural solvents and cleaners. And that particular industry, as you may be aware, if you drink orange juice, it's been hit by a number of challenges in the last sort of 5 years. That's resulted in their prices going up, 150%, something like that. So specifically things like the orange groves have been impacted by a blight, a fungal blight, for which there's no cure. So that's hit them pretty hard. And then the other thing that's really impacted the orange groves in both North and South America is the increased frequency and intensity of severe weather events, so hurricanes. So it's been a real problem for the orange groves and the basically downstream producers from there. So we can
what's
basically
your method of creating limonene, and how is it different, and what are the parameters that are different about it?
Sure. So we can basically recreate the biochemistry that happens in an orange, and we can do that in an engineered microbe and then create it by fermentation. So instead of having to be subject to the vagaries of the agricultural cycle, we can actually do this in a controlled environment such that a customer could call up an order and say, we want X amount on this date at this price.
Right. Well, how do you compare the yields, the byproducts, all the other factors involved, the energy inputs and everything? How does it look versus the current process?
Sure. It looks significantly advantaged, right? So we can do, the technical and economic modeling based on the metrics that we've demonstrated, and it all looks very, very favorable. So we obviously don't have access to sort of the energy and the economics on the current producer side, but we know what we can do it for. And at the end of the day, we know we can hit a price point that's roughly half of current market. So that gives us a lot of wiggle room in terms of what we are able to achieve.
So are all the products that you create based on using bacteria to produce them, or other microorganisms,
It is. So the core of our technology is how we go about engineering microbes to get them to do what we want them to do. And I'll spare you all the gory details, but you can think of it as just a highly efficient process. So we effectively use the microbes as catalysts, and so it's a two-stage process where in the first step we grow the catalyst. Then in the second step, we're no longer growing them, and we've essentially converted them into little bioconversion units. And so they take feedstock in and they put product out. And what our technology enables, and one of the factors that differentiates us, is that we can tailor the metabolism such that we just get the product that we're interested in. So we get very high yields. So we essentially make the biocatalyst. As part of that process, they naturally give off a little bit of CO2. And then other than that, it's the product. And then from there, this is all done in basically a minimal salt solution, if you will. So it's all defined. There's not much there. So it's a relatively benign process.
So for some of the chemicals that you make, I guess you feed the microorganisms something, a precursor, and then they digest it, and then their waste product is limonene, for instance, or whatever chemical you're looking for.
Yeah, so the feedstock we use is sugar, and in the U.S. that would be basically a corn-derived sugar. If you were in other places in the world, it may be cane, or it may be derived from straw, wheat straw, or wheatgrass, something like that. But in the U.S., that would be primarily corn sugar.
Okay, so sometimes the bacteria will literally eat the precursor of what you want to make. Sometimes just you'll feed them some other feedstock like sugar, and then they'll act as a catalyst of some chemical and turn it into another chemical.
Yeah, so just like any process, we take input, raw materials into the process, and the output is primarily the product. So the inputs for any fermentation process are the microbe itself, and then a sugar feedstock, and then water, and typically some type of if you have to control the pH in the fermentation, so you're typically adding a little bit of acid or base, air to oxygenate the environment, and that's kind of about it. And then the outputs for us would be the product, the water, which can essentially be recycled back through wastewater treatment. Salts can be recovered, that sort of thing, and then the leftover biomass. And there are a variety of ways to dispose of that. Everything from you could, it's relatively small amounts, so you could landfill it, you can incinerate it, you can use it as a fertilizer. There are all sorts of things, sort of depending on the local economics in terms of what makes sense.
So what are some of the difficulties in doing this? Why not do it for every chemical? What makes it hard to do it for certain ones versus others?
So it depends on a couple factors. So one factor is certainly technical. So what are you able to do with a microbe, and what are you able to achieve in terms of the key performance metrics? So things like the productivity, how much product the microbe is able to make, at what yield and at what rate, how fast they can make it, per volume per time, and that's defined by the biochemistry and the pathways. And then the other piece of the equation is how much do you need to sell it for? So in almost all of these markets and applications, in many cases markets exist. If not, there are sort of near neighbor or near relative markets. So you can get a sense of oh, well, this particular product sells for $5 per kilogram. And so you can actually translate those key metrics in terms of productivity into a minimum sales price, minimum selling price, so to get to that, call it $5 a kilogram, whatever it may be. And so you have to be able to hit the metrics, to hit the price point, such that people will actually buy it. So I think in the last decade, there was this, mythology, if you will, that, there's going to be a green premium and people will pay more for something that's sustainably sourced. And so this sort of biotech-based approaches, people would pay more for it. And I think while there may still be very few and far between examples of that, I think by and large, that's simply not the case, and that you have to be able to be competitive on the economics. And so that's our approach essentially to how we go about doing products. It's how is it made now? What's the price point? And at what price point do we think we can make it? And how can we be advantaged because of that? And if we happen to get a green premium on top of it, I think that's just a bonus. But I think many companies in the last decade were banking on that, and that didn't go so well for most of them.
Mm. So what are some of the dream chemicals that you'd like to produce?
Sure. So our technology is somewhat unique in that it's a platform technology, so it enables us to go after all sorts of different things. And so our approach to that has been, for the first set of products we're going after, let's go after things where markets exist, where there's certain opportunities that, really only we can leverage, so things that our technology enables. And then we'll get successes there, and then that opens up the opportunity for more. And so the first family of products that we're going after is in the amino acid space. And so these are things that are used in human and animal nutrition. They're currently made by fermentation, which is great. So it's a relatively low barrier to entry. They are smaller markets than some of the sort of the big 3 or 4 that exist out there. But what's interesting in talking to customers is they've said, hey, for these branched chain amino acids, we would happily, triple or 10x our consumption, our usage of them, if you could lower the price point. And it's become this sort of chicken or an egg, because the existing producers have consolidated. They're all very large companies. They just can't do development at a reasonable cost and timeline, and so they've basically been ignoring this opportunity because it's essentially too small for them. But it's a perfect fit for us, where we can say, with our technology, the speed and the efficiency at which we can operate, we can actually deliver that at that price point and capture that increase in the market size. So it's a really unique opportunity. So that's the amino acid family. And then we have a terpenoids family, which are limonene would be an example of that. But there's a number of different products out there. Many of them have markets in flavor, fragrance, other specialty chemicals, specialty solvents, things like that. Where in many cases they're derived from some type of plant material. And so we can recreate that biochemistry in the microbe and do it in a much more controlled and efficient manner.
Are there cases where the bacteria produce other byproducts that are beneficial, or because people want pure formulations of X, Y, or Z that you don't really look for those things, or you try to exclude them?
So one of the advantages of our technology is that we can be very precise in what we create. So for the most part, it's really just the product that we're going after. Historically, I think that has been the case. I think historically, most biotechnology approaches have resulted in a variety of different things. Some of them may be beneficial, some of them not. But with our very directed approach, that's generally not the case. So.
Well, fermentation is not always only produce one product process. It's probably really messy, but maybe in a good way. And I'm sure that all kinds of compounds are produced that may be more beneficial than just a single compound. That's why I ask. I mean, you're in that world, but you're asking that world of fermentation act differently than it's used to acting. So I just wonder what you've seen in that regard.
I think it depends on who you ask and what you're going after, right? So fermentation, you can do a lot of different things by it. It depends on what you're fermenting and what your approach is. And there are examples sort of across the spectrum, right? So if you look at the one extreme end of the spectrum, Think about the brewing or the ethanol industry, right? Yeasts are exquisitely efficient at producing ethanol and pretty much nothing else, ethanol and CO2. And that's sort of one good example. If you look at the other end of the spectrum, there's a whole bunch of folks working on, things called secondary metabolites, where they essentially go bioprospecting and they dig some random bug out of the dirt and they grow it up and they grow it in all sorts of different configurations and they get this sort of pool of products. Oftentimes you have no idea what they are. So you end up spending significant amounts of time and money to first isolate the compounds and figure out what they can do. So it can be an interesting way to do discovery, but it's highly inefficient to actually do production that way. So like I said, fermentation can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And our particular spin on it and our value proposition is that, we're going to do this in a very directed fashion. We're going to make things that other people have difficulty making, and we're going to do it in a way that's cost efficient.
Okay, got it. So where do you see this process going in the next 6 months or a year? Any new, chemicals you're going to work to produce, or tweaks to the process or changes?
So we've got a product portfolio that's growing every month. So I think we have about half a dozen that are ready to go to pilot scale. We're piloting our first one now. Our general plan is to take a new product to pilot scale roughly every 6 months. And then the business development cycle, essentially the way that works, is you essentially do the pilot scale, you produce samples, those go out to customers, they do acceptance testing, and then those translate back into offtake orders. And it's usually a 6 or 8 month cycle for customers to evaluate the samples and kind of come back and get those deals signed. And so we have development at lab scale ongoing. So I think in the next year, we would anticipate having anywhere from 20 to 30 different molecules with commercial metrics demonstrated at bench scale. And then based on sort of customer discovery and market interactions, we'll prioritize which products go to pilot scale next. So.
Okay. Well, very good. So what are some resources for listeners so they can find out more about what you're doing?
That's a great question. I don't know. Is
there a website they can go to, or should they look at social media?
You can certainly go to our website. So DMCbio.com would give a little introduction to us. We've got some technology related materials on there. There's some links out to other relevant articles in the space. So that'd be sort of, I guess, the first place to look.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Matt, I appreciate you coming on the podcast and spending the time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your time today.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.